Welcome to this new edition of the Tibet Talk. Tibet Talks are featuring live conversations about Tibet with engaging thinkers, leaders, activists, journalists, and artists. I'm Vincent Metten. I'm the EU Policy Director at the International Campaign for Tibet in Brussels, and I will moderate today's discussion. For years now, the People's Republic of China has ranked as one of the worst countries for press freedom in the world. The working conditions for foreign journalists continue to degrade overall in China. And according to the Foreign Correspondent Club of China, since 2013, when Xi Jinping's accession to power was completed, China has forced out 9 foreign journalists, either through expulsions or by non-renewal of visas. And last year in 2019, at least 12 correspondents received credentials valid for 6 months or less. And normally, this sort of permits are allowed for 1 year. And resident journalists have been affected by this, include the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, BBC, Telegraph Globe, and Mail, and also Le Monde, Shanghai Shimbun, and The Voice of America. In 2019, a foreign correspondent of the Wall Street Journal was expelled after being denied a visa. The Foreign Correspondent Club fears that China is preparing to expel even more journalists. So we see at the International Campaign of Tibet also that the overall conditions for journalists is going down, and it's more difficult for them to be active and work normally in China and Tibet. And if you take the situation in Tibet and Xinjiang, they are seen as China red zones, which means they are described by some journalists for Tibet as harder to visit than North Korea. The International Campaign for Tibet has documented the lack of access to Tibet and how Tibet remains completely isolated from the rest of the world. In these different reports, which are accessible on our website, you can certainly find more information and consult what we say about it. So you should see a cover page appearing of these reports that ICT is working on. So that's our 2 reports specifically on the issue of access to Tibet, or access denied, how we call it. So now the questions that are on the table today are what are the obstacles and challenges for foreign journalists who try to visit Tibet and report about the situation over there? What is China trying to hide in Tibet? And what is does the lack of independent reporting on the ground mean for accountability? So to try to answer to these 3 questions today, I'm very happy to welcome our guest. We have with us Ursula Gauthier. Ursula Gauthier was from 2009 until 2015 the permanent correspondent of the French media L'Obs in Beijing. She was expelled from China in 2015 because she was covering the situation in Xinjiang of the Uyghur community. But she continues actively to work on China from Paris. So welcome, Ursula, to our talk. We have Garrie van Pinxteren with us. Garrie is a sinologist and a journalist who has been active also with China issues for more than 30 years. In 2007, you have published a book in Dutch, which translation in English is China, Center of the World. And now you are again posted in Beijing, but as a correspondent for the NRC media. We would like very much to thank you also for being with us today. We appreciate your participation. And our third speaker, who cannot be physically with us today, is Brice Pedroletti. He's very known in France, but also outside France, because he's the ex-China bureau chief in Beijing, and he is working in the Asia desk for Le Monde. So even if he cannot be with us, he has shared a video message that we will show you in a couple of minutes. As I mentioned, Tibet is very difficult to visit for journalists, but not only for journalists, also for foreign political leaders, for members of parliament, and so on. And if you see a map of Tibet, I think it's important to show that and to explain that the access in particular is very difficult for the Tibet Autonomous Region. And on this map, you can see that the Tibet Autonomous Region is the one in a dark red. It's an administrative entity who was created in 65. And there, if you want to go as a journalist, but also as a tourist, you need a special permit in addition to your visa to China. And you have in lighter red the eastern part of Tibet known as Amdo and Kham for Tibetans, which include the provinces of Sichuan, Qinghai, and Gansu. So the historical Tibet, as we understand it, is the entire zone, the two red zones, not only the Tibet Autonomous Region. So now I would like to turn the floor to Ursula. You have been to Beijing, you have been traveling a lot in China, you have been to Tibetan areas on several occasions. We would very much like to hear from you your experience of your visit. Where have you been as a journalist? Did you go in your official capacity? Were you able to meet people? What were the obstacles that you faced? Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Vincent, and talk TTE Talks. I've been to Tibet many times since a long time ago. The first time was in the 80s.
Oh, the sound, I think, Ursula, the sound is not very good on your side. I think we can't hear you well. Oh, we can't hear you. So perhaps we'll ask Ursula to reconnect to the platform. And we'll, in the meantime, maybe we will switch. We'll start then with Garrie. We have to adapt. And then we'll turn back to Ursula just afterwards. So Garrie, you also have been to China, well, in the past, and you went back to the Netherlands, and then again you are now posted in China. And when you have not been to Tibet now, with this couple of months ago, but you have been there in 2008. We would very much to hear from you your experience about your visit to Tibet in the year of the Olympic Games. I remember very well because there were also some visits of journalists organized by the country over there with and they even went to the Jokang. Maybe some of you remember these strong images. So please, Garrie, can you explain us your experience in that year, please?
Yes, I hope also the connection from Beijing is okay, that you can hear me okay. Can you hear me? Yes.
Yeah.
So in 2008, I went just before March 2008. So just before, in fact, the uprisings in Tibet. I was there in January, February for the around the Chinese New Year. I was then also a journalist, but I traveled there for tourism officially. So I didn't apply. I didn't work there. But it was very hard already to get permission there to go as a journalist, but then not working there. And it was, I remember we also more or less had to escape from the people who were assigned to take care of us, but we did manage to do that. It was possible then still. It was also possible to speak to people, but people were already very careful. And it was already a feeling. They said, oh, you come from Beijing, so you come from a place where it's very free, which explains, well, which shows you the big difference there is between Beijing and Tibet in freedom. I mean, Beijing is not a free place, but compared to Tibet, it's much better. At that time, people sometimes still talked about, were honest in talking about certain things. Especially if they knew they wouldn't be quoted on it, but you could still talk a little bit to people. But it was difficult. But you could feel that many people were at that moment already not very happy about the situation they had to live in Tibet. But I didn't do any journalistic reporting then, so that might be good to say.
And which places did you visit at that time when you were there?
So I went to Lhasa, but we also traveled around a bit. So we did visit quite a few places in the area.
It was in the Tibet Autonomous Region now. Yeah.
It was in the Tibet Autonomous Region, yes. It was the region that you need a permit for, yes.
Okay. I'll come back to you afterwards for another trip you made to Xinjiang more recently, but I would like to turn again to Ursula, who is back with us. So, Ursula, could you restart your just explanation of what your visit to
Yes.
Tibet, please?
So do you hear me now?
We do.
Okay. I went in TAR before having the formal quality of correspondent. As soon as I became a correspondent in Beijing, based in Beijing, I couldn't go to TAR anymore. So the problem is, if you're in Beijing as a correspondent, you have a huge chunk of the Chinese territory where you cannot go. You have to apply for special visas, and they don't give it to you. You can go there as a correspondent only if you are in a group of journalists and other people, because I know that you will talk about this topic, but there are journalists, correspondents chosen by the Beijing Bureau of Correspondence, and then there are some other people who are invited from different countries who are friends of China, and they are supposedly journalists, but in fact they are not. They relay the Chinese propaganda. So the only way when you're in Beijing as a correspondent to go to the TAR, to Tibet, to Lhasa,
We can't hear you very well, Ursula.
You can't hear me?
No.
Now
Sorry.
you can hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you now, please.
Okay. So
No, you are interrupted. Connection is not so good with you. Yeah? Voilà. Oh, sorry. You are again. We see you, but in a very not fluent way.
being able to go to the Tibet Autonomous Region and to the other region, the light red region, the regions which are in the provinces of Qinghai and the western part of Sichuan province and the Gansu province. So I went many times there, special visa there. You just can go. You can go, but it doesn't mean that you are able to do the coverage. In fact, as soon as you are on the plane for Qinghai or for Sichuan, you are followed. In fact, when you arrive in Qinghai or in Sichuan, there are people who follow you. So in order to not be followed, I remember when I was a correspondent in Beijing, I had to use a number of tricks. I had to go through, for instance, I didn't go to the Qinghai capital. I did go to some other place in another province and then drive for 1,000 kilometers in order to get into Qinghai or to get into Sichuan. I would never go with a group of people, because if you are a number of people, people just see you and you are immediately referred to the authorities, and then you cannot do anything. You cannot talk to anyone, and you know that you put in danger the people with whom you talk. So most important were 2 times where I went to Qinghai. I wanted to go and find the families of people who just immolate themselves by fire. And twice I could find the families. In fact, we were two. I was with a colleague, another French journalist. I don't know if I can say his name. I'm not sure, so I won't say his name. And so we were two people, both of us speaking good Chinese, so no need for interpreters or drivers or fixers or anything. We would drive by ourselves. I told you, like 1,000 or 1,500 kilometers before getting to the place. And then we would go about and ask people that seemed more, safe, ask them, where is the house of the person who immolated himself or herself? So in one case, it was a man of 50, and in the second case, it was a young girl of 20 something. And both times, people would take us to the homes of those peoples, and it was really very fascinating because it was very difficult for journalists to get there. But the Tibetans were lots of them were going there to pay their respects and to bring, some small presents and to show that they cared about those persons. And the fact is, if you happen to encounter a policeman, it's over. It's over. You have to go back to where you came from. You have to go back to the capital and take a plane back to Beijing. So I think that we had the chance to not be caught by the police. Report with no damage. Just once, I remember we were in the car driving in this very desert. It's very large and there are very few people, and the villages are far in between, and you have to drive hundreds of kilometers from one place to another. And we were in this place, and then there was a police car which was hidden just at the entrance of one of the villages where we knew that it was a young female nun immolated. So we wanted to go to the village and try to find her family. And then there was a police car hidden just before the entrance of the village, and the police car stopped us. And then, in fact, they didn't stop us. Just when we saw the police car, we did a U-turn and we went away because we didn't want to talk with the police people, because we knew that it meant that we couldn't do our work anymore. So we made this U-turn, and then the police car chased us. And I remember the policeman.
We are a little bit interrupted again, Ursula. Sorry. No, we can't hear you anymore. Oh, well, you're back.
I'm back. So the policeman who went out of the car with a gun, and he was truly enraged that people came from Beijing, these foreigners came from Beijing and searched for trouble in this very remote place. And then when he looked at our telephones, because the first thing they do, they look at your telephone and they see what is stored in the telephone. And then it was, I remember, just days after the 18th Congress of the Communist Party. And both of us have been at this 18th Congress. And we had photos of the whole of the people in Beijing with, the whole people, there during the 18th Congress. And then when he saw those photos, the policeman was in awe or something, or afraid, and he thought maybe we were big shots. So he let us go. And that's how we didn't end up in a police station for the night and explaining what we were doing there. I'm saying this, just to make the people understand, it's a really, really, really difficult to go there and to be able to meet the people that you want to meet, and then to do it in a safe way in order not to put in danger the people who talk to you. And then when you go back in Beijing, sometimes you hear from your headquarters in Paris that the Chinese ambassador had called your chief editor, saying, what is this report? How can you allow your reporter to do this kind of things? So the fact is that Xinjiang, I have the same kind of experience in Xinjiang. In Xinjiang or in Tibetan areas, be it the TAR, the Tibet Autonomous Region, or the other regions, it's very difficult to do any kind of work. So I think that this experience that I'm relating were done in 2015. And I think that nowadays it will be far more difficult. I don't know if we would be able to find the house of a person who has just immolated. I'm not sure. So the things are becoming even harder, and the coverage is suffering. I mean, we don't really know what's happening there. I can talk also about another visit I did in 2015 at a very strange and inspiring place in the Tibetan not the Tibetan Autonomous Region, but it's in Qinghai, I think, or is it Western Sichuan? It's a kind of monastery, which is not a monastery with houses. It's a monastery with small, like an encampment, small houses for the monks and nuns who live there. And in fact, it's an academy. It's a university where people go to study Buddhism in the text. And as I had the chance to visit these two places, which are very famous. One is Larungar, and the other one is Yarchengar. And
we'll show you. We have some pictures because we knew you went there, so we will display some images that you have taken in Larungar, which is located in Garrie in the Sichuan province. So these are some pictures that you have taken in 2016, 15 during your trip. So maybe you can comment on this picture. Please go ahead.
Yes, extraordinary. I mean, there and in Larungar, there's and in both places, the speciality is the women. They are young nuns, young Tibetan persons who can go there, and they are paid. In fact, they receive a grant in order to study Buddhism, and because Tibetan society is a bit paternalistic, it's a bit how do you say, masculine, and women don't have the same privileges and freedoms as the men. But in these institutions, they try to overcome this problem, and it's a way to give an education to Tibetan women. And they are in Larungar only. They were at least 30,000 Tibetan women. And in fact, in this place, when I went there were 40,000 people living there at the same time. And part of them were monks. I mean, they were the minority. And another very interesting minority were Han people, Chinese Han people, who went to those academies and who wanted to study Buddhism seriously. And they have very talented and famous teachers who give lectures, and some of them are very fluent in Mandarin, and they give lectures in Chinese. So these places are really extraordinary. And at Larungar, which is the first important of these encampment style monasteries and academies. There was a few years back, they destroyed almost, I think, half of the encampment because they thought that there were too many people and it was beginning bigger and bigger, and it was difficult to control. So they destroyed that at that time. But by 2015, when I went, in fact, the place, the monastery was booming again. It was really incredible to see the number of people who came there and who built their own small house, very little houses, and all day they were going to the lectures, to the lessons, and to studies. And after I went there, something like 6 months after, Larongar was again in trouble. And as I know today, they destroyed huge parts of the encampment, and they put a system in. The aim was to be able to control the place and to know who goes where, etc., etc. In the previous disposition, it was very difficult to know what was going on because it was so. There were no roads and everything, so there was just one road, and those 40,000 people could go from one place to another without anyone knowing who was doing what. So, in fact, these places were not covered very much by the press, and even less by the foreign press, because in fact it's difficult to get there. It's the same thing. You can go there. You don't need to have a visa. But then when you arrive at the small town, Sertar, from which depends the Larongar, you find people who if you go through the town, it's sure that the policeman will ask you where you're going. At the entrance of Larongar, it's just a valley, so there is just one entrance. At the entrance, there's always control, etc. I managed to go there at a time where tension was less and surveillance was less important too. But then we had also to be very careful to go through after night. After night, the control was less, etc., etc. So you always have to be very thoughtful when you have to go to those places. And nowadays, I'm not sure that it's possible to go to Larongar and say what's happening there.
Thank you. I think that's very interesting because it highlights also one key issue for Tibetans. It's the freedom of religion, and the destruction of this biggest Buddhist institute in China is reflecting how China or Chinese authority want to control and limit the influence of Buddhism and religion over society. So I think this is what you pointed out.
There's one thing that I want to say there, because when you read literature, the people who go to Tibet with the groups organized by the Foreign Ministry of China, they always tell you, well, see, they're there, they're doing their prayers, they can do their pilgrimages, they can go to those places to study with them. See, it's free. Religion is not only tolerated, but it's welcome in Tibet. But it's not true. In fact, what you see in Larongar is that the pressure from the society is so big. And then you can add to that the pressure from the Chinese society.
You're interrupted again. Maybe I will.
Because
now. Sorry.
Back? Hello.
Yeah.
Is it back?
Yeah, you're back.
Okay. I just want to say that if you see this, if you can still see this, it's not because how the Chinese government is accepting the religion and everything. It's just because the society is so deeply religious that it would be really impossible to control the society if they didn't let a little bit of space for this. And now inside the Chinese society, you also have the Chinese Han people who are interested by Tibetan Buddhism, and they do apply some pressure on the government. And some of those people that I met in Laronga are not ordinary people. They are high-level people with influence. And so the government has to take into consideration this element. And if they could, they would ban all religious activity. It's because they cannot that you are still able to see those Tibetans praying publicly, etc. That is a very important point.
Thank you for raising that. Before we go back to Garrie, I would like to, because time is moving forward, to show now the contribution of Brice Pedroletti from Le Monde, because he, as both of you have experienced, visit on the ground and explains the difficulty and obstacle he has faced. So we'll listen to him about 10 minutes and then we'll come back to both of you.
Hi everyone. So in my case, I'm going to try to be brief. So I was a correspondent in China, in Beijing, from 2004 to 2018. I've never been to the Tibetan Autonomous Region. That's the only place in China where, as a journalist, you need a special authorization. When I started to be in Beijing from 2010, I requested a few times to go. I was rejected. I've probably missed some press trips because usually they would make an announcement very quickly and you have to answer, and the quota would be filled up also very quickly. Then at one point, I think it was in the years 2013, 14, there was no more press trips. So I've never been able to go to the TAR. Of course, I was. The important thing was to go to Tibet, to the other areas, which means the Tibetan prefectures within the Chinese provinces of Sichuan, Qinghai, and also Gansu. That was very important because it's a very significant place. You have 3.5 million Tibetans living there, more than in the Tibetan Autonomous Region. That's also where there were some of the most important events. The protests of 2008, there was a lot of the repression that went there afterwards. The self-immolations, there are also a lot of environmental issues and issues with the urbanization and the land. So all these areas which are not in the TAR but are part of the historical Tibet are very important to cover. The rule is that theoretically we are allowed to go there as journalists. We don't need to get any local authorization. But in practice, every time you would go while there is an event going on, like a protest, the access would often be blocked. They would block all accesses to the place, or try to do so, even though this is not officially announced. Well, there were a few times where Abba, for example, was officially blocked. I mean, one of the area of Abba was officially announced as blocked, but in a lot of cases they wouldn't even say it officially. So, but when you go there, they would block you before you arrive and say for security reasons you cannot go. So that's one of the aspects. So I also wanted to give you a few recent examples of what happened. The last time I went was 2018, March. It was actually the worst in terms of the way they followed and the constraints. It might mean that things are getting harder and harder, but it's also because the circumstances. It was in March, just before the NPC, the National People's Congress, where Xi Jinping was going to lift the limits of his mandate, so it made everything more sensitive. What happened is that I went to Chengdu and I stayed a few days in order to meet Tibetans in Wuhuozi, which is the district of Chengdu with a lot of Tibetans. And after a while I realized that they already started to follow me at this point, so that was a bad start. Then the idea was to go to Aba prefecture, and I decided to go there to see what a French insurance company was doing. They were insuring yaks, 700,000 yaks. So it was quite interesting to see how it works. It was, of course, a government program. There were subsidies. So I decided to go there in this context, which was in a way easier. So things worked out fine. We went to Hongyuan. There were the representatives of the companies, there were the officials as well, and we met herders. And after that, I decided, we said, I mean, I had an assistant with me. We decided to stay on our own and to go on our own. So I told them I'm going on my own. But after a while, when we got into the neighboring county, Zoiga, we realized we were followed all the time. So I talked to the guys and they said, don't go to monasteries. Which was quite bad that they said that, because it meant that if I was going, they would have some instructions and they might come in more numbers and I might have to go back to Chengdu. So at that point we decided to go into Gansu, which was very close. So when we went to Gansu, they stopped at the border between Sichuan and Gansu, because it's another province. We were free for most of the day. There was a big Tibetan festival in Langmusse, which is a famous town with a Kirti monastery. The thing is that in the morning, the day after, when I started to have conversation with Tibetans, there were two Tibetans who were speaking Chinese. I'm not sure they were Tibetan or Chinese, but in any way, they started to, get into the conversation, and I asked them who they were, and they said they were from the Y band. So again, these guys stayed with us, so they were nice. We could talk of a few things, but of course, it was quite inconvenient if we wanted to interview anyone on some subjects. So after a while we left Langmusse, we went back into Sichuan on the way to Chengdu, and we were followed the whole time. So this time it was not just one county, but they followed us up to Chengdu. So that situation in 2000 was quite tough. The year before that, in 2017, I had an experience in Ganze, which is also in Sichuan, where we were quite successful in doing what we wanted, even though there were quite a lot of restrictions. At the time, I rented a car, which I do every time, and I was driving. We were three foreigners, including a photographer, and there was my Chinese assistant. For the first week, we were very free. We had no encounters, no checks. When we registered in hotels, which is quite important because in hotels you have to show your visa, and then they see that there is a journalist visa, that they might know we are here and they might come to check. But luckily, we almost had no registration. We would arrive in the evening in small hotels and we would leave in the morning. The first thing we did was I was covering a lithium mine, like for the batteries of smartphones and electric cars, which was high on the highlands. And this mine, there had been an environmental incident and some protests from the herders because the river was polluted by leaks from the mine. So there had been protests, but these protests had been happening a few months before. So we went into the mine. It was a very, very large mine, so actually the road was going through it, but we had no problem with the guards. I mean, even though they saw we were there, they didn't call anyone. We find some herders right there, and we were quite lucky. After that, I got the contact of a herder who was in the city that had been, where there had been this water problem, Lagang. So we went directly to the guy address. Of course, we would not call him in advance. We would go directly. And then he called someone else who had some photos that he showed us. We stayed for about an hour and then we left. So that first week was quite successful and we had no problems. We were lucky, but also, we were very careful every time. After that, we went to Yarungar and Yarchengar, which are the two monastic cities where they were having new regulations to actually lower the number of nuns and monks. So it was quite sensitive. In Yarchengar, we went in, we walked for about an hour, not on the main road, we avoided that, but then they arrested us, they took us to the police headquarters. They just said that you need to register, so we said fine, but except that, they made us stay the whole afternoon and then they wanted us to leave by car. So we said, well, we're not going to drive through the night. So we went with them, they brought us to a hotel, we had to stay the night and we left in the morning. So they just wanted us to leave. So it was still okay and we left. Then we went to Ganze. We saw they were surveilling us at some point and then we were alone again. We went into Luhuo, which is one of the main towns on the way back to Chengdu, but still in Ganze. So we went there was nobody. We rented a car so that in the morning we can take another car to go to Larungar and to go up to the checkpoint, which we did. And then I went around the checkpoint, I went to Larungar, I went back, and when I went back they were waiting at the hotel, but they had no idea where I had been, so they were just asking, where have you been the whole day? And I said, well, I've been hiking and all that. But from then, it was the end of the trip. We knew we had, we had what we wanted. So we saw that after, on the way back to Chengdu, they were there all the time. They followed us by car up to Chengdu. And even in Chengdu, the next day, when we were meeting, some friends in Chengdu, they were with us. We were seeing them around, so it was quite interesting. So these were, the few recent examples where you have some control, and it's hard to work, but you still can have some opportunities to do things. Thanks a lot for listening to these to
Okay, that's a very interesting testimony by Brice. Thank you. Thanks to him. I would like to turn now to Garrie. You've been to, not to Tibet recently, but you've been to Xinjiang, and I wanted to hear about your visit there. Could you give us some explanation, please?
Yes, it was in a way very surprising to me because my colleagues had gone before and they had all had big troubles in doing anything in Xinjiang. They were immediately stopped or accosted by plainclothes police or just ordinary police, and they were very, very limited in anything they could do. So I had expected the same. But what in fact happened is that I was met at the airport of Kashgar, where I went, and the people of the local Foreign Affairs Office, which is the Waiban that was just mentioned. That's the Foreign Affairs Office. They asked me what my plans were, why I was there, what I wanted to do, if I wanted to, what places I wanted to visit, and they offered to help me and go to these places together. I said, well, I'd rather do it on my own. Then they indeed let me go on my own to my hotel. But next morning in the hotel there were people from this foreign affairs me who offered again if they could help me and if they could accompany me. But when I said no, they dropped me off somewhere in Kashgar and they let me go on my own. But there was something happening that I think might even be much more frightening in the end and threatening than being followed. Because nowadays, with the new technology, I think that's also used in Tibet and in Xinjiang definitely, but also in Tibet, they don't need to physically follow you anymore to be able to know all what you're doing. Like in the taxis in Xinjiang now, they have they record everything, the image and the sound. So you cannot even talk to a taxi driver because that will all be recorded. If you go into a restaurant, there will be cameras and there will be recordings. And it's not only that I noticed that, but it's of course that all the people in Xinjiang know. So there is no need anymore for a lot of following around. It has become more. It had become. I found it was very surreal because I could walk freely on my own, but nobody would say a word. Nobody would really talk to me. Like the Han Chinese people would still talk, but would only say things like, we're very happy here and this is the most peaceful area of the whole of China. It is very safe because there's a lot of policing. We live in harmony with the different peoples here together, so it's really a good place to be. The Uyghurs, like the minority there, would not say anything at all, would kindly smile, but would not answer any question that might even in far distance be sensitive. So you could only talk about noodles and about tea, but practically about nothing else. About food a little bit, but that was it. So that it became as if you walked around in your own bubble that you could not leave in no way. So in that sense, I think it has become more difficult, but also more scary and also more easy for the Chinese government to say, well, you've been in Xinjiang, we didn't stop you at all. You had the opportunity to look with your own eyes what it was like, and you didn't find anything irregular. So it has become more refined. And the idea that you could kind of escape surveillance by taking different routes or driving your own car or doing all these things, that has become more and more impossible. You cannot escape surveillance, even if only because of the phone you carry, but much more so because there are cameras everywhere. Things are recorded. And everybody you speak to is limited. So it was really a very dystopic experience for me to be in Xinjiang, I must say.
Thank you, Garrie. I think you tackle very different points. The control over people through, also the new technologies, and that's it's increasing a lot everywhere in China, in particular in sensitive areas as Tibet and Xinjiang, and also the control over narratives. And this brings me to another issue I would like to talk about. It's the visit by a group of journalists, because now what you testified, three of you, is how you went by yourself or with one colleague to the region, and you were able to travel in a clever way by trying to, not be trapped or stopped during your visit. But the Chinese authorities are also organizing a group visit, state-sponsored visit to Tibet or to Xinjiang. And for instance, in 2019, there was a group of 30 journalists who went to Tibet and they were from Britain, Italy, Switzerland, Argentina, Nepal, and a couple of other experts were also in the group. And you can see on this picture the group, or some of them, visiting elementary school in south of the Tibet Autonomous Region. And again, this year, in November 2020, a group of journalists was invited to go to Tibet Autonomous Region. And I would like to show now a short extract from a video that has been released by Channel News Asia, where they illustrate this group visit to give you an idea of how it's organized. So we'll show that now.
It's just a 4.5-hour flight from Beijing to Tibet's capital, Lhasa. But getting permission to access the region is not as easy, especially if you're a diplomat or a foreign journalist like me. This time, though, we are entering the sensitive autonomous region on a rare invitation from the Chinese government. For a week, we traveled to various cities in Tibet, officials keen to show us housing projects, schools, and happy locals, which they said were examples of its success. The government claims over 628,000 people in the region were lifted out of poverty by the end of last year. But due to a packed schedule and language barriers, we had little time to explore or speak to ordinary Tibetans on our own. Though there were moments on this trip where we caught a glimpse of what it means to live in one of the most closely watched and guarded regions in China.
So that's interesting because so these journalists, they are part of a group, but they keep I would say, a critical eye on what they were shown. Chinese authority tried to show that they have, developed Tibet, they have brought prosperity, people are happy, and they try to give this perception. My question to Ursula first, briefly, do you think that this group visits have a certain impact on certain journalists? Do some people buy into that and then report positively afterwards, you think?
From what I know, some of my colleagues, French colleagues, were admitted in some of the groups earlier, and they went because it was the only possibility to go to the Tibetan Autonomous Region, for instance, or even to Xinjiang. And they're happy to go, but afterward, the articles they wrote were content, and they showed what was the government tried to show, and they showed that all that was changed. In fact, it's Potemkin. It's a kind of Potemkin trips. So they wrote that, and what I know is that the Chinese military was not happy and told them that they were very disappointed. So in this, you find people, have journalists who do their work, and they relate what they see and what they don't see. And you have the other people who are a bunch of propagandists, in fact, more or less, I suppose, paid by the Chinese government. At least all their expenses are paid. And they, every year or so, they go to China and they give their testimony on how it's going so well in those regions. And this kind of people could also attack me, for instance, in France, saying that I'm propagating lies, that it's not true, that they've been there, and they can say that all that I say is fake. So it's a real propaganda operation, in fact. And for professional journalists, it's still interesting, given the fact that we don't have, I mean, as long as I was a correspondent, I couldn't go to the TAR. If I have had the opportunity to go there, it would have been interesting, even with the limitations.
Yes, I recall a journalist from Europe who was part of such a trip, and I think the knowledge of the journalist was not very deep about the situation on the ground. And then the person came back with a mixed feeling. Oh yeah, I think not everything is good, but we saw this project and this, and it was interesting, and this greenhouse and this development project. And so in a way, something also was, impacting her in a half positive way. So I was a little bit surprised, but nevertheless, I think that you can keep a critical eye on such a visit, of course. Is it also your opinion, Garrie? How do you see these group trips?
Well, if I would have a chance to go on such a group trip, I would definitely go, because at least you have some opportunity to see something. I think there is one important element that wasn't yet mentioned about these trips, which is the propaganda value it has internally in China itself. Because these things, there are, I think, often also Chinese media there who report on these reporting trips. And then I think you kind of lose any kind of control about how you will be portrayed in Chinese media during your visit to Tibet, and you will basically be used to show like, well, here are these foreigners seeing it for themselves, these foreign journalists, so this is how open we are, and they've been quite positive, and they've been impressed, and this, that, and the other. So it is in that sense a difficult one, that you're also used for that, and that it might be a very important aspect of these trips. I have not been on a trip to Tibet like that, but I have been once on a trip also offered by and organized by the Chinese Communist Party to China, with researchers and journalists. They selected mainly people who knew quite little about China. And there they can be more effective. I think the more you know about China, the less welcome you are usually on these trips. So it is meant for people who are just wondering, what is it true what they say about China? What's it really like? And these people can sometimes be very or a little bit, or not at all, it depends, impressed by these trips, and feel that they can sometimes change their minds a little. But what struck me most clearly about the trip that I was on is the absolute use they made of us being there. Like there were places we went where they told us practically nothing, but they moved us from one place or one room or one house to the other, so that they could make many shots of us visiting there. So it's a very double-edged sword in that sense as well.
So it serves also internal propaganda, of course, and we see that after even diplomatic tour there, you will see positive, narratives, and then sometimes diplomats criticizing, this is absolutely not what I said or what I saw, but it's too late. It's out, it's circulating, so it's difficult to counter this kind of internal or public communication. Perhaps the last question before we conclude, as time we reached the end of our talk. One question we received concerned about foreign journalist activities outside China. Are journalists also pressured when they write about sensitive issues like Tibet, Xinjiang, Hong Kong, or Taiwan, or on political issues? But it's outside the country. Is this also the case in your experience, Ursula?
Yes. In fact, just during this summer, I published a cover story about the current developments in Chinese foreign relations, and it was called something like the Chinese hyperpower trying to take over the world. something like that. And it was a cover story with 16-page inside. So the Chinese ambassador called my direction, and they expressed that they were unhappy, and they even wanted to publish a response, which was not accepted. So if you are of the kind that is easily impressed, then you will be scared by these tactics. But they are ordinary tactics. It just, if you don't take into account, you can live with it. There's no problem. But the fact is, every time that they can, they will apply pressure in order to get the kind of discourse they want.
You also have to be supported or helped by your editors, of course. If your editors are weak,
important.
then they might point at you and say, oh, you have to change your narrative. So you have to be one team and strong team, and that's probably the best, if possible.
Fortunately, we're not yet there.
Yeah. Garrie, what's your experience on this issue?
I think also that we're not yet there, that our editors desert us. I don't think that is happening so much. But we had a lot of pressure on our newspaper to indeed not so much change stories that we published, but to publish the letters of Chinese officials. And this pressure was also exercised, like I would then be called here in China, and they would tell me, well, we have sent, like the Ministry of Foreign Affairs would say, well, send this letter of, who was it, I think Li Keqiang, to your newspaper, and your opinion editor has promised that he would publish this letter. But now they are not publishing it. Do you know what's happening? And can you maybe ask them about this? And then I would say, well, I'm sorry to say, but I'm a foreign correspondent, so I'm not involved at all in the opinion letters that they may or may not publish. But I did, of course, ask my newspaper what they thought the story was. And they had only said, well, if you have this letter, send it to us and we'll look at it. And then they said, well, we cannot publish this letter because it's not really an opinion letter. It's too long. It's not specific enough, so we won't do it. And then they said, well, we cannot change even a comma or a full stop in this article because we simply cannot. It should be published as is and completely this way. And then I thought, what's happening there? And I think this is also a pressure that Chinese embassies are under. That they are, one of their very important jobs is, like as it is for, I think, Chinese state media journalists who live abroad, is to make publicity or good publicity for Chinese state visits or for the Chinese side. So they are also, on the one hand, they have to push the newspaper to publish a letter like that, but on the other hand, they are not allowed to be flexible in that, because then the Ministry of Foreign Affairs will not be happy. I think this pressure becomes an issue when, for instance, you have a foreign journalist that still has to get his or her accreditation for China. Then what do you do? Or then how do you weigh? Or if you are, for instance, like Bloomberg is a press agency, but it's also selling machines to China with which you can read what shares are doing, if they're going up and down, and it's big complicated machines that they sell to China. Now, if China in the past has started to threaten Bloomberg that they wouldn't buy these machines anymore if the reporting, if Bloomberg would continue to pursue the issues about personal wealth of Chinese leaders. So then what do you do? You know, if there's a commercial interest in there, and it becomes difficult, but also if there's another interest of your correspondent in China who might be pressurized or who might not get accreditation. So it becomes, there are ways, I think this pressure, I think in the future it will become harder and harder also for media to handle this. because Chinese power is growing and the dependence is growing. So what do you do then? But for the moment, I have never experienced that my editors or my newspaper would not stand behind me and would publish a Chinese letter that they didn't want to publish. However, they did publish Chinese advertisements, Chinese government advertisements.
Yeah, we've been working on that. We have also introduced a complaint against Le Soir in Belgium because they were publishing, inserts with Chinese propaganda, and the Council on Ethics said there was a confusion between information and publicity, and they asked the the newspaper, to be more clear in their publication. So it was a little victory, symbolic, but still. And I would encourage participants, if they want to know more about the conditions of foreign journalists in China, to know more about it. There is an excellent report by the Foreign Correspondent Club of China called Control, Halt, Delete, Reporting in China Under the Threat of Expulsion, where they speak about one of the some topics you raised, like the use of the permits to work there as a weapon against their freedom of expression. So I would like to conclude today by saying that we have again listened to your presentation and heard the difficulties that journalists have to access Tibet, to report on Tibet, to have information about human rights situation there in Xinjiang also. But I would say that the opposite is not true. We have the access for Chinese journalists or for tourists or for diplomats in our countries is almost unlimited. Once they got a visa, they can go everywhere they want. They can meet everyone they want. And so there is a very asymmetrical relation in our, between the European countries or United States and China. And this is the reason why for instance, the US has adopted a Reciprocal Access to Tibet Act, which is is a response to the exclusion of US citizens from accessing to Tibet. And this is put in place a system of sanction for Chinese officials who are responsible for blocking access to the territory for US citizens. And ICT believes this should be also now discussed in Europe. We should have a similar, similar systems of sanctioning Chinese responsible for blocking access for our citizens, or for our journalists. It is an unfair situation which has to be addressed. So I would like to conclude today's discussion with this suggestion and recommendation. We really hope that you have enjoyed it, and I would like to thank the speakers that were with us, Ursula, Garrie, and Brice. And there will be another Tibet talk tomorrow, coinciding with the Human Rights Day, and it will take place, it's in Dutch, and it's organized by our office in Amsterdam, about military training camps in Tibet and Xinjiang, with the participation of the representative of the Tibetan community, Uyghur community, and also Amnesty International. So we invite you to listen to that talks if you speak Dutch, of course. So again, thank you to all the speakers. I hope you have enjoyed the talk, and we hope to see you again soon. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.